Hello, this is Dr. Esa. Let's continue with the Greek class, and we're going to look at the verbal roots today. Perhaps if this sounds complicated, you can just think of it in terms of irregularities within the verbs. Let's see what we can find. So when we start looking at the irregularities in the future tense and present stem, we're going to start talking about the roots and tense stems more and more. So root of a verb is its most basic form. So for example, we can have the verb luo and its root is lu, and that's usually indicated by this star here. Then when we talk about stem, it is closely related to the root. Sometimes it's identical, but most of the time it's not. Stem means basic form of the verb in a particular tense. So present stem of ballo is bal, but the future stem of ballo is actually bal with only one lambda, whereas present tense has two lambdas. So the relationship of the verbal root and present stem. We're going to start looking at different verbal patterns. In the pattern 1 verbs, verbal root is identical to the present tense stem, even though that's usually quite uncommon. Then patterns 2 to 4 verbs, verbal root is modified when forming the present tense stem. So actually the root is not the same as the present stem. So here's an illustration. For verbs, we have the verbal root, and then we can identify the present stem that is connected to the verbal root, future stem connected to the verbal root, and aorist stem that is connected to the verbal root. So let's start looking at the various verbal patterns. So in pattern 1, the root is not modified. So we have the verb luo. Obviously, here's the future tense luso, and we have poieso and blepso. Each one has a different pattern. Pattern 2, so in other words, in pattern 1, the future looks very similar to the present and follows a consistent pattern as only the sigma is being added to the root. And in the blepso, this situation, we have the P and sigma that contract into the C. Then pattern 2, we have different forms. So from this on, we can perhaps start talking about the irregular verbs. For example, we have horao, and we can see that in the future it becomes opsomai, notably different both in the way that the stem operates, and also you can see that the ending becomes actually the middle ending. Moving forward, we have other examples of erkomai, and then it becomes in the future, it becomes eleusomai. So I come and I will come. And notice all of these stars or these verbal patterns. There's a different stem in present and a future. Different stem in present and in the future. Now you don't need to necessarily remember that or know these, but FYI. And then we also have the verb lego, I say, and in the future tense it becomes ero. Again, different present stem and the future stem. So pattern 3 includes the liquid futures. Notice the consonants that precede the tense formative and the personal ending. So they're mostly formed regularly except in certain cases. Specifically, slightly different tense formative is epsilon sigma rather than sigma as usual in the future. So present and future stem are slightly different. So future active indicative in what are known the liquid verbs. So the verbs that end in this consonant. So here you can see, for example, the verb meno, so men, and now we add the epsilon sigma and then the ending. So now we see here some contraction happening, and the end result is actually menumen, and the circumflex indicates that there has some contractions have taken place. And obviously, since the sigma is not obvious and you cannot visibly see that, that can be a source of confusion. So here you can see the paradigm of future active indicative, and so meno, I will remain, meneis, menei, menumen, meneite, menusin. And really the only way to distinguish this from the regular present verb is that circumflex in most or all of these situations above the personal ending, where we really should have the sigma, but it's contracted and the circumflex indicates that contraction has taken place. If we look at the future middle indicative in the same verb, we notice that the same pattern takes place. The only difference is now obviously that we have a different personal ending here that indicates it is middle. So menumai, mene, meneitai, menumetha, meneisthe, menuntai. So notice the personal ending is the one that indicates that this is middle and not the active voice. So sometimes we can have confusion and we are unable to distinguish between liquid and contract verbs. So really the key to this is to memorize the lexical forms and note the final stem consonants so that we're able to make distinguish between the two. Also need to pay close attention to the accents. The liquid future has circumflex over contracted vowels, with the only exception being the plural first person in the middle voice. And there are no contraction on the present stem. And also pay attention to the stem changes. So we can see that in the liquid verbs, the present and future stems often are different, but just a little bit. So let's take an example here. So in some situations, we have an addition of double consonant. So apostello, notice 2 lambdas, is present tense, and then in the future it is apostello. So I send, I will send. Similarly, ballo becomes ballo. Sometimes we have an addition of iota. So airo becomes aro, and obviously the aro would be the root, and then it would be airo, so the iota would be added here. Similarly, in practice, obviously it looks quite different, or the other way around. So egeiro is I raise up, and egero I will raise up. And sometimes we have completely different roots as we looked at before. So Lego, I say, and in the future it is ero, I will say. There's really nothing that can help us to distinguish the two except the fact that we will just memorize it. And finally, we have the pattern 4, which indicates the root is modified regularly. The question here is whether we're going to memorize the patterns or all the dense forms. So if we have a root in a stop, in other words, we have a verb that ends in idzo or adzo, such as baptizo, I baptize, then the delta and sigma actually ends up becoming sigma. This should be fairly straightforward. We have asso verbs. Tarasso becomes tarakso, something that we already looked at these patterns earlier. And then we have ekballo. I throw out becomes ekballo. So very similar when we have the double consonant or one consonant falling out, as we just saw earlier. And then we have airo, that becomes aro, as we saw earlier. And then we have a little bit more complicated situation where we have apothnesko, and the root, the stem here is apothan, so it becomes apothanumai in future. Similarly, ginosko, the stem is gno. Perhaps you heard about the Gnosticism, so that's where we also have the where we get this word. So gnosomai. So ginosko, I know, and future I will know is gnosomai.